Sunday School teacher, I'm glad that you have joined us for our time of study and preparation. We are working on the Bible study for Sunday, February the 10th. The title of the lesson is Tempted. Now, you've been with us through this entire study in the book of Genesis. You know that we're looking at the life of Joseph now, and here we are today talking about a lesson entitled Tempted. Well, you've been teaching Sunday school long enough to know what we're going to be looking at with that passage of Scripture in Genesis chapter 39. We're going to be looking at a time when Joseph was tempted. You've probably read this a lot. You've probably taught this a lot. Your people in your group may have already studied this umpteen times in their lifetime. But let's just pray that God gives them something new when dealing with temptation. Point of the lesson is that God is honored when we are faithful to Him and to His standards. This session, again, will focus on the time when Joseph, now a slave in Egypt, is tempted. Joseph didn't choose these difficult circumstances. My goodness, his brothers had sold him into slavery. Nevertheless, the Lord was with Joseph and helped him to succeed in a difficult life situation. Joseph showed a growing faith in God by resisting temptation of sexual sin and afterward the temptation to be bitter of being falsely accused and imprisoned and forgotten. We spend so many times talking about the temptation of the sex. And maybe the bigger temptation was the temptation to be bitter. Well, we're looking at that life. Joseph was sold to Potiphar, who was an officer in the Egyptian Pharaoh's court. He was a high government official. Joseph quickly rose to prominence as a servant in Potiphar's household, and he was put in charge of Potiphar's entire household and his possessions, and we see that in verses 1 through 6. So let's look at this. We'll see successful, Genesis 39, verses 3 through 6. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord made everything he did successful, Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all he owned under his authority. From the time that he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. The Lord's blessing was on all he owned in his house and in his fields. He left all he owned under Joseph's authority. He did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Again, Joseph is now a slave in Egypt. Joseph did not know what the future would be. He had gone from being the favorite child in a life of ease to now being a slave. But we know that God was preparing him, that God was with him, and that God was making the way. God would use all of the circumstances in Joseph's life to fulfill a greater purpose that He had for Joseph and indeed for all of Israel. The evidence of God's presence was his success. That's what verse 3 is all about. The reason that Joseph was successful, the reason that he was able to rise in prominence was because of God. He says that he became the personal assistant to Potiphar. That's the same role, same description, same title that is used to describe Joshua in his role with Moses. Potiphar recognized Joseph's integrity and his leadership giftedness. Because Joseph was in charge, the Lord blessed. And again, that verse 6, that he did not concern himself with anything except what he ate, is an affirmation of the fact that Potiphar didn't have to worry about anything. Joseph took care of everything. He had no worries. It speaks of his integrity and his abilities. He was successful. Then something happened. Look at verse 6 through 12. And there we see the temptation. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. Do you remember back when we were having the lesson about Rachel, his mother, and Rachel and Leah? Remember we said that Leah was the not too good to look at, and it said that Rachel had a beautiful body and was very attractive. The words that were used there are the same words that are used here to describe her son. But it's on the masculine that we see. So he was well built and he was handsome. After some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." But he refused. "Look," he said to his master's wife, "with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns under his authority. No one in this house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do this immense evil, and how could I do this? How could I sin against God?" Although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her. Now one day he went to the house to do his work, and none of the household servants were there. She grabbed him by his garment and said, "Sleep with me." But leaving his garment in her hand, he escaped and ran outside. The temptation. Going back to that description there in verse 6 of Joseph and his appearance. Remember that one of the reasons that they hated Joseph was that he was the favorite child, that he was a dreamer. But also another reason that they may have been jealous of him is that he was the best looking of the group. And they let that get to them as well. In verse 7, Potiphar's wife had been lusting after Joseph for some time. Joseph was not aware of that. He was just doing his job. He had no reason to think that this was something that was going to happen. He was in charge of everything. And he could have had that attitude. Well, Potiphar has put me in charge of everything, and I'm over everything. And this is just a woman. She's not above me. So because I'm in charge of everything, I'm in charge of her, and I can have my way with her. He could have rationalized his sin that way. But no, he didn't. He accepted the fact that it was sin, that it was wrong, and stood for what was right. Joseph did not want to disappoint his master in verse 8. And that's a powerful motivation. Yes, we want to not disappoint those who are important to us. In verse 9 again, he says that he had everything but her. And so in verse 9, what he does, Joseph looks at the master's wife, and number one, he reminds her of her commitment. You're his wife. You're not supposed to want anything but him. And then number two, he said to her, this is wrong. What you're trying to do is wrong. I'm a slave, I'm a nobody, and I know that it's wrong. And then number three, he recognizes that it would be against God, not just Potiphar. Well, she didn't give up. She didn't let that 3-point sermon that he preached change her mind or turn her away from her sinful desires. She stayed after him day after day after day. And day after day after day, he stood his ground and stood what was right. Verse 11 gives the introduction that he's going to work, going into the house. And we don't know if it was a day where everybody just didn't happen to be there, or whether she sent everybody away with a plan. I tend to think that she sent them away. I think that her sin, her desire, caused her to scheme and to come up with a plan to say, everybody out, I don't want anybody here today. And Joseph didn't know about it. Well, it says in verse 12 that she took hold of his garment, his robe. They didn't wear shirts and breeches like we wear. They wore a robe. They didn't have buttons. They just simply had a robe that went around and had a tie on it. And so she grabs hold of that garment and begins to pull, and she's wanting to have sex. And she would not let go. Well, he ran. He literally ran out of his clothes. He ran away from the temptation, and he did the right thing. Look at verse 19 there of chapter 39. When his master heard the story from his wife, these are the things your slave did to me. He was furious and had him thrown into prison, where the king's prisoners are held. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him, and he granted him favor with the prison's warden. Again, we see God showing favor toward Joseph. To cover her actions, Potiphar's wife, there she is. She's got Joseph's clothes, his robe, in her hand. How's she going to explain that? Well, what she did is she summoned the other servants. She screamed and told them that Joseph had tried to force himself on her, leaving his cloak behind, and that's when she screamed for help. That's verses 13 through 15. Well, in the verses that we read, is when the husband hears the story. The husband comes home, Potiphar. She tells him the same story. And in verse 19, who's he going to believe? I mean, he had no reason not to believe his wife. Even though she was a scoundrel. In verse 20, we see that Joseph is put into what you and I would call a minimum security prison. When it says there, and where is it? In verse 20, where the king's prisoners are confined. This is not a maximum security prison, but this is a low security prison. But he was in prison, and he was far, 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 far away from his dreams of one who would have his own family worship and bow down to him. Well, here we are again. Joseph is in a place. What's he going to do? Well, he had the same integrity. He had the same work ethic. He had the same loyalty that he had shown in Potiphar's household. And because he was true, the warden goes, this guy's a good guy. Hard worker. You can trust him. And the warden showed him appreciation. Well, in your outline, summary points. Number one, believers should seek to honor God in all that we do. Everything we do, everything we think, everything we say, we should seek to honor God in all that we do. And if what we do and what we say and what we don't and what we think does not honor God, it's sin. We should seek to honor Him in all that we do. Number 2, believers can resist sin, remembering God's standards and the joy that we get in honoring Him. Joseph, even though he honored God, but the situation didn't look good, he kept the joy. Number 3, believers can be assured that God abides with those who seek to honor Him. God was with Joseph. So, let's think about creating interest. As the people gather for our group on Sunday morning, what are we going to do? Ask them to answer 2 questions. Number 1, what do you think it would feel like to be falsely accused of a crime? What do you think it feels like? And then number 2, how would you react if you were put in jail for something that you didn't do? I mean, that's all the things that happened to Joseph. I mean, even before you mention the Bible study or anything, maybe even think about some current events where someone has been falsely accused. And then think about maybe someone who got put in jail for the wrong and they weren't even guilty. Maybe give a current event and say, how would you feel if you were falsely accused? How would you feel if you were put in jail? And then do the Bible study. And then the closing challenge each person to identify the temptation they face. The temptation that Joseph faced was Potiphar's wife. The temptation that Joseph faced was growing bitter and angry over his situation. He did not sin. So ask each person to identify the temptation they face and make the commitment to follow Joseph's example and flee from it. If it is a temptation of pornography, don't go anywhere near it. If it's a temptation of a thought, of anger, or whatever, deal with it, but make the commitment to follow Joseph's example. Well, I'll be praying for you as you teach this lesson on being tempted. Remember that God is honored when we are faithful to Him and His standards. God bless you.